Our session just before tea is titled A Mixed Legacy, The Many Facets of Indira Gandhi. For this, I'd like to invite on stage Mr. Jairam Ramesh, Mr. Srinath Raghavan, and Mr. Shekhar Gupta. This session will be moderated by Ms. Mini Kapoor, Ideas Editor, The Hindu.
Shekhar's coming in just a minute, but I could start by introducing our remaining guests. Since we're discussing Indira Gandhi, three people who all will have different things to say about her, but very, very knowledgeable about her. Srinath Raghavan, a historian, has written a book on 71, a global history, which sort of, Indira Gandhi's shiniest year, probably. And now he's working on history of India in the 1970s. So I think that's the decade where we saw two sides of Mrs. Gandhi, and we'll look to you. Mr. Jairam Ramesh is a Congress politician, but he's recently published two books on Indira Gandhi. One about her love of nature and her appreciation of India's ecology, and the other about her relationship with P.N. Huxer, probably the most influential, if I may say, advisor she had. And one of Mrs. Gandhi's great characteristics was that she never spurned good advice. In fact, she always liked people around her, and Huxer was the most prominent among them, so we will look to Mr. Ramesh to tell us more about that. There is I don't think there's any other leader or even a public figure who defies easy assessments as much as Indira Gandhi does. And I think part of it is something Srinath Raghavan wrote in an essay, that there are two things two characteristics that always interplayed. Oh, Shekhar's here. Shekhar, long-time editor-in-chief of the Indian Express for 19 years, and now founder and editor-chief of The Print, a digital startup. Shekhar met Indira Gandhi as a young journalist when she was out of power. So he saw her then, and then you saw her at one of her toughest moments in Assam. There is this interplay of insecurity and leadership in Indira Gandhi. And it was not as if she had phases where she showed signs of insecurity and signs of a great leader. I mean, really great qualities. They sort of, played out at different times. And I'm just wondering if I can open the floor to anyone who'd like to take the question, whether in assessing Indira Gandhi or figuring out what's her legacy, should we consider her, especially her time as a prime minister, chronologically to make sense of her? Is there an arc that we can draw?
Well, as a historian, I would say that there is certainly a chronological arc, without which it is very difficult, because I think subjective assessments which are based on character, personality, can only get us that far. At the end of the day, politics is about reacting to public events, about relating to challenges that you face. Can you hear me now? Yeah, okay. Even I can hear myself better. Yeah. All right. Yeah, so as I was saying, I think personality-based assessments can only take us that far. Yeah. They are important. They do give us some glimpses of what kinds of fundamental instincts that public leaders have. But I think there is no escaping the historical chronology of the period. The second reason I'd say is that 1970s particularly is an extraordinary decade in India's contemporary history. In fact, I'd say it is the decade, and if you treat the 1970s as a bit of a long 1970s, right? So say if you take it from about 1967 till about the early 1980s, that's really the period when we undergo this major historical transition from being this, again, to use a shorthand, a Nehruvian polity economy society, to something that is closer to the India in which we now live. And I think that extraordinary transitions of that period happened not just in India, but in a much wider global context. And I think without really taking that historical context into account, it's very difficult, at least for people like me who are historians, to be able to make any considered judgments about her performance. Because ultimately, a purely psychological approach, I think, can only take us that far.
Mr. Ramesh?
Well, I think it's very interesting that the period of 1966 to 1969 sees a very uncertain, a very tentative, a very weak Indira Gandhi. She comes into her own in the later part of 1969. She actually comes into her own in July of 1969 and reaches a peak in 1969 with the split of the Congress party. Actually not a split, she's expelled from the party in November of 69. And 70 and 71 and part of 72 really see, after she gets this unprecedented mandate, sees a completely different Indira Gandhi, which is totally different from the 66 to 69 period. She reaches her peak in 72, and once you have reached a peak, the only trajectory is to come down. And she had her rise was meteoric, her fall was precipitate. And you know, she fell from the heights of glory in 73 onwards. And a large part of it has to do with the economic trends of what happened in the 70s, the political developments. In fact, the seeds of her destruction in the 70s were sown in the huge mandates that she got in the national election in 1971 and in the assembly elections in 1972. She won 80% of the assembly seats in 1972, and that's when the problems for her began in Bihar and Gujarat. And the politics of Bihar and the politics of Gujarat determined the fate of Indira Gandhi in the 70s, leading up, of course, to the emergency. The post-80s Indira Gandhi is dramatically different from the 70s Indira Gandhi. Gone is the ideology. It's very pragmatic. Gone is the suspicion of the United States. Gone is the suspicion of private investment. Gone is the suspicion of foreign investment. So the post-1980s, although Punjab and Assam consumed her politically, sees a completely Indira Gandhi. So when you do an analysis of Indira Gandhi, it's really many faces of Indira Gandhi. It's not the same person, unlike most characters of Indian politics, whether it's Gandhi or whether it's Nehru or Patel and so on. There's a certain consistency about them. But there has been a glorious inconsistency as far as Indira Gandhi is concerned.
Well, I think there clearly is a pre-69 Indira Gandhi and post-69 Indira Gandhi. There is a pre-emergency Indira Gandhi and post-emergency Indira Gandhi. But there is inadequate thought about a pre-Sanjay Indira Gandhi and a post-Sanjay Indira Gandhi. So 1980 she came back to power, but 1980 is also when Sanjay Gandhi dies, entirely unexpectedly, very young. So the manner in which that changed her, I think has not been properly studied. Now people like us who were reporters at that time, we ended up, we didn't have proximity to politicians at that level, but we ended up covering at the cutting edge a lot of the crises she dealt with, including Assam, Northeast, Punjab, etc., etc. But I think we need better understanding of how that death affected her, because from what we understand, again, this is journalistic information, she became a lot more superstitious, her faith in Babas and Tantrics, and all this fear of bad spirits coming through birds in her home and sealing the ventilators and the windows, etc., etc., all started after 1980. So, but at the same time, reading stuff that Srinath's written, you've also written, her mind had changed ideologically because she sought out that meeting with Reagan in Cancun. She was embarrassed about India's vote on Afghanistan. She was also embarrassed by, I think, was it T.N. Call, his speech on Afghanistan at the UN. So a new, much more complex Indira Gandhi emerged. If she had survived long enough, maybe we would have analyzed her better. But I think the Indira Gandhi we understand the least is the Indira Gandhi that's the closest to us.
Well, one of the shortfalls or the shortcomings in most biographies and analysis of Indira Gandhi is the prehistory of Indira Gandhi. And to explain why she took the sharp ideological position that she took in the 70s, which Srinath has referred to, I think we need to go back to 1958. Because 1950, politics then in India there was a sharp right wing and there was a sharp left wing. In 1958, sees the emergence of the right wing in the Congress party. India has its first major foreign exchange crisis in 1958. The Aid India Consortium is constituted. So you have the combined might of the Western powers. Nehru himself is beginning to lose his grip on the party, so much so that in 1960, he is unable to enforce his writ when Chow Enlai and Cheney are here for the border negotiations. And it's really Govind Vallabh Pant and Morarji Desai, Swaran Singh and Radhakrishnan who are calling the shots. So I would argue, as not as a politician, but as a pseudo-historian, 58 to 66, 67 is the period in which the S.K. Patils, the Atulya Ghoshas, the Nijlingappas, these were the people who were really powerful. And there had to be a reaction, and that reaction came in 1969. It came with Haksar, it came with Kumaramangalam, it came with C. Subramaniam, and I think that was the sharp cleavage that took place. And 73 is a crucial year because in 5 months' time, Indira Gandhi loses 3 of her closest ideological confidants. She loses Haksar on the 15th of January 1973. Haksar goes. She loses Pitambar Pant on the 28th of February 1973 because he passes away. And on the 31st of May 1973, Mohan Kumaramangalam dies in an air crash. So the 3 most important ideological pillars of Indira Gandhi in the 60s and 70s vanished from the scene. And that's when Sanjay Gandhi starts becoming much more influential when it comes to policy.
And since you talked about 73, that's when the Yom Kippur War takes place and the oil shock comes and India's inflation begins to rise.
She was also very affected by the Allende assassination all at the same time. So how much did the international
I don't think it was
affect
the
her?
Allende assassination seen as an isolated event. Her entire perception, I think, was that the Cold War was intensifying in a significant way in the Third World. And that, in a sense, as far as a country like India was concerned, there has to be something like a holding operation of keeping these Cold War powers at bay. And believe me, that also included the Soviet Union, which she knew quite well had a sort of extensive set of operations happening in the Third World. So to that extent, there was definitely a larger Cold War context. But I think the more immediate thing which happens in 73, which Shekhar referred to, is the sort of Arab-Israeli conflict, the OPEC, sort of really jacking up oil prices. And then in a period between October 1973 and September 1974, you have extraordinary inflation in this country. At one point it's 33%. Just imagine, 33% inflation in a country like India. It is in that context that I think the politics of the country changes. The Navnirman movement really gets going in that specific context. But it's also in that context that she starts rethinking, I think, many of her sort of older policies and so on, right? 1973, I think, Jairam, is also important because of the wheat nationalization episode.
Yeah, and the only one that she went back on.
Exactly, which I think is a very, very significant thing, because there was an attempt as part of this, very, very strong socialist move to nationalize the entire wheat trade in the country, which was a pretty extraordinary sort of attempt to cut out all kinds of middlemen and to sort of centralize this under the state. And the person who was driving it was the chairman of the Planning Commission, D.P. Dhar. And Mrs. Gandhi actually sort of went along with that exercise only to face an enormous sort of pressure from Congress chief ministers, local leaders saying that, listen, you are effectively undermining our own power base by nationalizing this wheat trade. And after a period of 6 months, she actually rolled back. And I think that was in some ways a watershed moment in a sense that that's when her more sort of liberal economic advisors like P.N. Dhar and others start getting a more active role in this. And it's, without that, I don't think it is possible to explain how in the year 1974, Mrs. Gandhi actually signs this agreement to sort of take a contingency loan from the IMF, which the chief economic advisor at that point of time leads the effort, Dr. Manmohan Singh, incidentally. So, what you see is this kind of very important shift already happening, both in politics, but also in terms of economics, economic policy in the 73-74 period. But the contradictions of it come about in a way that she's not able to manage, and that leads to the emergency.
And just to build up to the emergency from here, did she inexplicably lose her nerve on the Gujarat Assembly dissolution, Shekhar? I mean, that seems to then just begin the slide.
Well, it is possible, but there was a set of crises, and one was coming up on top of the other. There was the Allahabad judgment.
That was later.
Yeah, that was later, but there was all. See, I think she had thought that Pokhran would turn public opinion. It did not. I mean, you study cinema. Look at 1969-74. The dominant theme of the big Hindi cinema in those 5 years is unemployment, berozgari, महंगाई, roti kapda aur makan. In fact, the big hits are roti kapda aur makan, etc., etc. So, starting with Mere Apne. So, I don't think she didn't know everything. And she didn't quite know how unhappy the people were. I think she had begun to misunderstand electoral support or votes for general index of happiness. That wasn't the case. These were very tough times for India. We were still standing in ration shops. In small towns, we were still buying our cloth at ration shops. So these were tough times, and she had not prepared India for 5 years of tough times. So I think it was a combination of all these things. Something must have tipped it. It's possible that one of our advisors said, unless you do this, ma'am, God knows what's going to happen. There is Mujibur Rahman, there is Chile. But we don't quite know. We trust pseudo-historians like Jairam, Ramesh to find out.
Well, I think thank you.
You said it. I am only echoing your words.
I think the politics of Bihar and Gujarat are crucial to understanding what happens before the emergency period. She has got unprecedented electoral mandates in these states, with the choice of Abdul Ghaffur in Bihar and the choice of first Kantilal Ghia and Chimanbhai Patel in Gujarat has ripple effect consequences. Moraji Desai becomes the fulcrum in Gujarat and JP becomes the fulcrum in Bihar. And then you have this extraordinary High Court judgment in 1975. And I don't think anybody in this hall would know what were the charges that she was held guilty of. It's amazing in today's context.
That she got a magistrate to fix her.
No. She was held guilty for... Raj Narayan went to the Allahabad High Court saying she has violated the Representation of People's Act on 6 counts. Justice Sinha exonerated her on 4 counts and held her guilty of 2 corrupt practices. What are these corrupt practices? Corrupt practice number 1. The mic and the rostrum in Rai Bareli for the Prime Minister was put up by the state administration.
By the magistrate there.
By the
DM.
DM. By the DM. Yeah. That was corrupt practice number 1. And corrupt practice number 2, Yashpal Kapoor, who was her OSD, had resigned on the 13th of January 1971, but his resignation was accepted on the 27th of January 1971, so for 14 days he drew government salary. These were the 2 counts on which she was held guilty. Today, you will laugh at these charges. However, the law is the law is the law. I asked Prashant Bhushan, whose father was the lawyer for Raj Narayan, he was taking down notes in Allahabad. I asked Prashant. Prashant said, yes, these were technicalities, but the majesty of the law has to be upheld. And so it was upheld, and then the politics of this country changed dramatically. But I think we tend to look upon the emergency as a consequence of the Allahabad High Court judgment, but there is a prehistory to this. I think what happened to the politics in 73, as Shekhar says, what happens to double-digit inflation, the railway strike of May 1974, which is roughly contemporaneous with the Pokhran explosion, roughly contemporaneous. Yeah. I mean, Indian politics was going through convulsions. We had 22% inflation in 73-74. We had 27% inflation in 74-75. Of course, then it comes down dramatically. But those 2.5 years were periods of acute economic distress, which we today, it's a dim memory in the past, but they had political consequences. And 75, I think, was a reflection of that.
75 and then 77, because Indira Gandhi is almost like a playbook, and what are her leaders, what are the instincts you heed, and what are the instincts you are wary of. Why did she lift emergency? I mean, we always talk about emergency as the darkest period, but that was one of her great moments, and was.
Well, so yesterday, in fact, Fali Nariman had an article in the Indian Express.
And you were a bit mischievous with that.
No, I was not mischievous. I mean, he said that, somebody told him that he had on good authority from Mrs. Gandhi herself that it was President Jimmy Carter who advised her to sort
It was a very Latvian story.
By the way,
And-
that article by Fali Nariman was factually completely inaccurate.
Yeah. You know-
because Mr. Carter came to India when Morarji Desai was
Exactly.
Prime
Yes,
Minister,
yes.
not when Indira Gandhi was Prime Minister.
That's what he said in his. That's why I said he was mischievous because he tweeted that.
exactly.
Don't always believe the Indian Express.
Yeah, or people's memories. So,
Fali Narim,
but broadly
we
speaking,
have an old love affair
but broadly
which has
speaking, I think-
outlasted the Express.
So we have 2 or 3 theories, right? And there is no smoking gun evidence that is yet turned up. I'd be very surprised if one turns up in due course as well. So the first kind of theory is that Mrs. Gandhi actually was told by the Intelligence Bureau that she's going to sort of have a thumping election victory, right? So the assessment was that things were going up really sort of, and this is the right time to get on with doing those things. A second kind of theory, which is the mirror image of, is the opposite of it, which says that actually things were going pretty pear-shaped and that in some ways it would have been better to sort of take your chances now while there are chances to be taken. And that is something that P.N. Dhar writes in his book. And I think Dhar Saab knew her thinking much more closely at that point. The optimistic IB story has never been sort of corroborated in any straightforward sense. There is a third argument, which again I think is kind of worth examining, which is that Indira Gandhi herself was quite uncomfortable with the emergency. The fact that she had to sort of go down this route, imprison so many senior opposition leaders, many of whom were her father's contemporaries, do away with civil liberties, and so on. I think it undercut her own image of herself as this democratic politician. Because let's not forget, at one level we all keep talking about, the emergency, the sort of, abrogation of civil liberties, and so on. But Indira Gandhi was also quite instrumental in changing the character of Indian democracy during her period. I mean, in her early phase, I think the kinds of social groups which came out and voted for the Congress party was unprecedented. I mean, particularly at the lower orders of the society. So in a sense, I think she saw herself as someone who was also a very radical Democrat in some ways. And I think that contradiction could also have caught up. So that's the sort of third kind of explanation. Now, I don't think a more personalized explanation is necessarily sort of exclusive to any of these things. But I think it's safe to say that, post Sanjay Gandhi's sort of anointment in 1976, once the excesses of the emergency became clear, I think Mrs. Gandhi felt that it was better to sort of take a chance with the people than to continue with this in the long run.
Well, I've speculated on this in the Huxer book, and frankly, it's all speculation. Nobody knows the definitive account. She and she alone called for elections, nobody else. There is a conversation between Mr. Huxer and Indira Gandhi, which I have quoted in the book, which is there in the Huxer papers. Huxer actually advises her to lift the emergency and call for elections. We forget, she didn't lift the emergency and call for elections, she only called for elections. The emergency got lifted after the election results came. She called for elections on the 18th of January 1977. And I have a bizarre theory. And the theory is that this was 1 week after Bhutto had called for elections in Pakistan. And internationally, which Mrs. Gandhi was very sensitive to, particularly in the British press, where she had a lot of friends going back to the 1930s, Bhutto was being painted as a Democrat, and Indira Gandhi was being painted as this authoritarian figure. I don't think it's a coincidence that she, immediately a week following Bhutto's announcement of elections in Pakistan, she takes that route. And if I were a psycho-historian, I mean, if I were, doing some psychological analysis of Indira Gandhi, I would say that Nehru's daughter Indira Gandhi realized that she was Nehru's daughter and not Sanjay's mother. I mean, this would be a psychological explanation, because ultimately I think she was a Democrat. There is a contemporaneous letter that Mr. Sharda Prasad, who was her closest aide, wrote to one of his ex-colleagues in the Prime Minister's Secretariat on the 20th of July 1975, after the emergency had been imposed, where Sharda Prasad describes Indira Gandhi and saying how ridiculous it is for people to assume that Indira Gandhi is not democratic. She is democratic. The mistake that JP has made is to allow all these forces to be controlled by the RSS. And it is this RSS factor that has been responsible for Indira Gandhi's decision. I mean, this is one observer's theory. Incidentally, this is also a theory that finds its place in the P. N. Dhar book also. So I think she was a reluctant authoritarian. She was a Democrat. Ram Guha will not agree. But I think she was a reluctant authoritarian. She stumbled into the emergency. It was not a well planned out strategy. It was Siddhartha Shankar Ray who gave her that opinion. And of course, everybody supported it. There were no dissenting voices in the cabinet. She called the cabinet at 6 o'clock in the morning anyway, when half of them were half asleep. And the emergency was ratified. So I think we'll never know the truth of why she called for the elections. But the evidence that I have seen, I mean, the written evidence, which is the best evidence, not oral, anecdotal evidence, this optimism of the IB is not borne out at all. This argument that the IB told her, you're going to sweep India, that's not borne out. There is no written evidence for that.
In fact, Jairam, I mean, if we can sort of ask a slightly different but related question, right, which actually her contemporaries asked at that point of time, which is to say that when she called for the election, why didn't she rig it? In fact, I've seen letters exchanged in prison.
Why didn't she rig it?
Rig it, right? I mean, Charan Singh and Jayaprakash Narayan. And Charan Singh writes to JP saying that, she's called for this election. Let's be totally assured it's going to be a full sham. She's going to make sure she comes back with a thumping majority, which incidentally was a course very much open to her. So I think the real question is to, instead of speculating just on motives, is also to look at the kind of behavior which follows from the decision. If she wanted to, she could have rigged that election. There was hardly any opposition to speak of.
So if I can follow that up, after the election, Indira Gandhi just threw herself into, she lost. It was crushing. She lost her own seat. She threw herself into the public sphere. I mean, she made Janata Party look foolish when they tried to arrest her. She would appear at every function she was invited to. In fact, she appeared at a Pakistan High Commission function where the High Commissioner was shocked to see her. So he had Vajpayee sitting on one side and Indira on the other. So isn't it tempting to think that she knew she would lose, but she had to lose to come back into the democratic fold?
I think from what I have been able to assess, and again, this is purely based on my reading of the Haksar papers and the accounts of Haksar's interactions with her, Indira Gandhi was convinced that she was going to lose the elections the day Bahuguna and Jagjeevan Ram deserted her, which I think happened on the 4th or the 5th of February 1977, when the Congress for Democracy was formed. Mrs. Alva is here. She was a key player in that period. She may have more information on this. But it was the formation of the CFD. When both Jagjeevan Ram and Bahuguna deserted her, the evidence that I have seen tends lead me to the conclusion that she was aware that she was going to lose. She may not have been aware of the extent of her loss, but the fact that she was going to lose the election was pretty much obvious to her by early February of 1977, which was a good month, 40 days before the elections actually happened.
Shekhar, once she was out of power, is that when we saw her, we saw what an instinctive, fine politician she could be?
Well, yes, because she was being an opposition leader for the first time. She
took to it like fish to water.
I mean, she was also helped along by the contradictions of the Janata Party and the desperation of Charan Singh to put her in jail even if for a night. But she also knew how to play the media. Remember, she made that stop on that culvert when she was arrested, yes? So cameras could come in, they could take pictures. She went to Belchi on that elephant. It moves very slowly. Some photographers can catch up with you. This was still late 70s, so media was not so active and not so everywhere. But, since two of you historians are here, I have another question. One mystery about her is, why did she lift the emergency? The second mystery about her, also in my mind, is why did she sign that Shimla agreement? Instead of saying the line of control, why did she not settle what she could have settled at that point?
Shekhar, read my book, because this is not a mystery. This is not a mystery. The mystery is why she called for elections. That's a mystery. But why she signed Shimla is just not a mystery. It's very clear what happened in those 4 days in Shimla. The key was on the last night when the talks had broken down on the 2nd July 1972. Dinner, no agreement. Bhutto was going to go back without an agreement. The three of them, Dhar, Haksar and Indira Gandhi meet. Then there's an argument. Then Dhar leaves. Then Haksar and Indira Gandhi have this tete-a-tete. And at 12:40, the Shimla agreement is signed. Now, why are you calling it a mystery? You're calling it a mystery because you wanted the line of control. You wanted the line of control to be declared as an international border. This is retrospective angst. This is completely unrealistic to expect in 1972 that you would go to Shimla and you would bamboozle Mr. Bhutto, a defeated Mr. Bhutto, to actually sign the LOC as an international border. Manekshaw, there were three issues in Shimla. The return of territory, 93,000 prisoners of war, and LOC as the international border. Manekshaw advises Indira Gandhi, Madam, 93,000 prisoners of war are useless for us. So that issue is settled. Vacation of occupied territory, genuine difference of view. Mr. Haksar says to Mrs. Gandhi, look, the Americans and the Chinese are against us. The Soviets will desert us if we continue to have expansionist aims on the western border. So that issue gets settled. And there is no way we can sit in 2019 and regret the fact that the LOC was not made into the line of, into the international border. But, don't forget, there is also a resolution of the Indian Parliament which says that J&K is one, that Azad Kashmir is part of Indian Parliament.
But that is now, I think we are stretching it because she had the power at that point to swing that with Indian public opinion as well. So after a decisive war, India and Pakistan, she would have known that there won't be another decisive war. Because on the Western Front, even in 71, even though the Pakistanis were getting a hiding on the eastern side, they fought quite well on the Western Front. In fact, in many places they fought better than us. It's heresy to say so these days, but that's the truth. So she would have known that there won't be an opportunity now to roll over Western Pakistan and settle Kashmir one way or the other. If she didn't do it then that's what Mr. Advani always says whenever he's asked and whenever these talks were going on with Musharraf, etc. He said, "Bhai, agar ye hona tha, to ye Indira ji ne tab kar liya hota." So,
before Srinath, who's the authority on 71, says something, let me just say that Indira Gandhi's bitterest critic was C. Rajagopalachari. And Rajagopalachari said on the 4th of July 1972, the Shimla Agreement is the Pact of Good Hope. He called it the Pact of Good Hope. And JP, who was to become her bugbear 2 years later, hoped for repeated Shimla summits.
But JP was a bleeding heart.
I'm just saying. So I think he's the authority on 71. And only he can educate us on why.
I think you've written that it was one of her best hours.
Well, okay. So there are two questions, right? So one is whether India could have actually gone on and attacked West Pakistan or conquered all of Kashmir and so on. That was never on the cards because the Americans had made it very clear that any move to attack West Pakistan would be taken very seriously. They would invoke their alliance commitments. There was already the 7th Fleet in the Bay of Bengal and so on, right? So we wanted to consolidate victory in the east rather than doing anything in the west. So I don't think that was it. The second question is that if you read all the sort of documents preparatory to Shimla and so on, the expectation is actually something very different. What they want to achieve in the Shimla agreement is to convert the Kashmir issue from an international to a bilateral problem. That was the main objective. The objective is that we have been caught in the internationalization of this Kashmir dispute. Let us make it into a bilateral one. Whether the line is permanent or not, etc., can be decided later. I don't think those were issues. The third point, which I think is quite salient, and we know this, is that the Soviet Union was actually very clear that India should not sort of force anything on Pakistan. And there, again, I will give credit to Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. The first country he visits after the defeat of East Pakistan is actually the Soviet Union. He plays his cards very well, right? And he comes up with this idea. And also, from a longer term perspective, if you think about the kind of settlement that was thought of, that the line of control will be a line, over a period of time it will come to acquire the characteristics of an international border and so on and so forth. in some ways, that is possibly the only rational solution to the Kashmir problem. That is what Manmohan Singh and Musharraf attempted in 2006, something along those lines. I think an eventual settlement will have to be something like that. This idea that even if we had imposed a solution by diktat, a future Pakistan government would have disavowed it. I don't think Bhutto's survival would have been imperiled the very day when he went back to Pakistan. So I think, it is anachronistic to assume that either the Indians wanted it or that they could have gotten it. I mean, of course, all of this is being said with the benefit of hindsight.
So when we think of Indira Gandhi's legacy, which is the subject of this discussion, she changed India. I think we would agree on that. What was her most definitive intervention? Was it, when she nationalized banks, abolished privy purses, and various stuff, where she put the poor center stage in Indian politics? They hadn't been center stage before that. Was it when she imposed the emergency? I think we've all been alerted to the fears, not to the fears, we have to be on alert that our own constitution allows our freedoms to be fettered. Was it when she called for elections? Because I think that sort of closed the door to an emergency, I hope, being imposed again. Was it when she read that the world had changed when she came back to power? She immediately started. She was pre-91 prime minister. If she had been prime minister, 91 reforms may have happened. So which is the definitive phase?
So,
or when she made party and government
I would say none of the above, in fact. I mean, if you ask me what is the most salient contribution, at least in sort of political economy terms, it is the Green Revolution, hands down. Without the Green Revolution, we would have had Indian troops in Afghanistan today. It's as simple and straight as that. That was the extent of our dependence on the United States for food aid. I think getting food self-sufficiency for India in that geopolitical context was possibly her most important accomplishment. And I don't think we should take away from that. The second question is about her economic policies and so on, right? And again, I'm not saying that it's necessarily a good or a bad thing, but I think it's still to be recognized that some of the changes that we associate with a much later period, say Mrs. Gandhi's last term in office in 1980 onwards, which is, economists describe it as a sort of a pro-business turn, actually is something which starts happening from the mid-70s. I mean, so one of the constituencies which is very supportive of the emergency in this country is actually the big business. You only have to read any speech given by J.R.D. Tata. J.R.D. Tata in January 1977, just a couple of days before Mrs. Gandhi is, announcing the elections, actually says the emergency is the best thing which has happened. Labor disputes are at an all-time low. Inflation has been curbed. People have been put on the mat. Everyone turns up for work at the right time. This is the best condition that this country needs in order to do this. Now, hard economic data actually support that view, right? If you look at capital formation, particularly private investment in the period from 1975 to 1980, right? Particularly 1975 to 1977, there's a huge spurt. Because private capital in India actually believes this is the right time to start doing things because finally we have a government which is getting the act together. And again, going only in contrast to what was happening in the couple of years before. So I think Mrs. Gandhi already sort of embraces big business, from about the time of the emergency. If you look at her re-election in 1980, when she comes back to power, there is a private dinner hosted in her honor in the Ashok Hotel, which Mrs. Gandhi actually attends for a short period of time. And her host is a man who was not very well known then, but was Dhirubhai Ambani, right? Mrs. Gandhi, Prime Minister-elect, actually attends the dinner. So we are seeing a very important shift in Indian political economy happening in and around the emergency. And I think that had a long-term consequence as well. So I would say these two things are, of course, emergency from a negative example, right? Because it's a memento mori. It reminds us that this democracy can also die. It performs a negative function. But if you ask, what are the more longer term?
In a BBC interview, she said, I had to sustain the emergency because the economy was not back on track. So she...
Yeah, so and again, if you look at the 20-point program, a lot of it is justification on the economic grounds. But again, it's interesting. People tend to sort of describe, historians still, we tend to describe Mrs. Gandhi as sort of having this socialist phase from which she came out very late. But if you look at emergency, I mean, her entire attitude towards organized labor is totally antagonistic. I don't think she can be called socialist in any straightforward sense of the word by that point of time, right? Which is why big capital actually believes that the emergency is a good thing. So I think, I think those are consequential.
Well, I would, I agree the Green Revolution is an iconic achievement, but I would argue that there is a prehistory to the Green Revolution as well.
It started under Shastri years.
I mean, it reached its peak during Indira Gandhi's time. And we have to thank Lyndon Johnson and General Ne Win for our Green Revolution, because had they not, twisted the arms of Indira Gandhi in 1966, the urgency of the Green Revolution may not have been as evident as it was. There's the space achievement. Again, there is a prehistory to the space achievement. There is a prehistory to bank nationalization. There's a prehistory to privy purses. So what is that one thing that I would associate with Indira Gandhi, which is unique to Indira Gandhi? And I am going to say something which will irritate, agitate Shekhar, and say that the one distinctive contribution of Indira Gandhi to our politics is to bring environment into the mainstream of the political discourse. Now, Ram has called her an authoritarian ecologist, and Madhav Gadgil and he both have called her. But we can argue about that. But to make ecology the central driving theme of her governance, I think was not Nehruvian, certainly. It was Indira Gandhian. And to talk of climate change, deforestation, pollution in the early 70s, when the media was not sensitive to it, civil society was not sensitive to it, when these were seen as elitist, middle-class pastimes. There are some people who still think they are middle-class, elitist pastimes, but we'll leave those people aside for the time being. However, if you were to ask me, push me, I would say Indira Gandhi's distinctive contribution was ecology and ecological balance as part of development. And that's a lesson that continues to be relevant even today.
Shekhar?
See, we've had a long discussion, and I'm surprised that we haven't, until now, mentioned Indira Gandhi's contribution to internal security. Indira Gandhi in 1966 inherited a very insecure India. Punjabi Suba movement was on. Remember, 66 Punjab was split. 66 February, the Mizo insurgency broke out. She was very new and very weak, but she used Indian Air Force in Mizoram, which is something that nobody has thought of doing since then, which, Scroll, etc., are now sort of writing long articles about. But she did it in 1966. She fought the Nagas quite viciously. She used 71 to militarily weaken the Naxalites, yes, but also militarily nearly finish the Mizos, which paved the way for peace. The first Naga peace accord was 1975, right, when the dominant Naga tribes came out. Then that election of Assam, which I covered, and where we really hated her because she said that she forced that election on the people of Assam, and 7,000 people died. As I've grown older and I've thought through and I've seen the Assam movement evolve, and something that we did not accept at that time because we were young and gullible and idealistic, but which came to pass that there was a strong impulse to the Assam movement that was driven by the RSS, by the dislike of the Muslims. And if she had not held that election, Assam had continued to be under president's rule for a very long time. Oil could not go out of Assam. It was independent territory. In fact, on Independence Day in Assam, you could not have Independence Day because ASU would call a curfew. And they would hold a People's Independence Day where government will impose a curfew, but you could go on ASU's passes. Government of India's rate didn't run. So she took that risk. It went out of her control, but she took that risk, she held that election, and since then, politics has been restored in Assam. Again, within the same 18 months in Punjab. In fact, not even 18 months, the same 15 months. I do not believe that in a Bhindranwale kind of situation in June of 84, I have to say this carefully because so much time has passed, I don't believe that any method other than what she used would have worked. Now, this could have been done better. Militarily, this could have been handled better. The generals could have been less arrogant, etc., etc. All that is a matter of tactics. But the fact is that she had the courage, because she knew the risks. Sikhs are mainstream. She knew the risks of going there. With those two actions, I think she contributed to India's internal security in a manner that no other leader has done. Because subsequent to her, I do not believe any leader would have been able to handle those challenges if they persisted. Rajiv, of course, contributed greatly by signing those 2 accords very early on in his tenure. In fact, he signed 3. One failed in Punjab, but Mizoram and Assam worked.
Shall we open to questions?
Why should the contributions of a strong leader, for good or bad, be reduced to one distinctive achievement or trait? It's very journalistic, isn't it? And you historians are pandering to this journalistic demand.
I agree entirely with you, Mr. Ram. Blame is with Minnie, because she asked us to identify one achievement. But the fact is that, like, all great leaders, her legacy is mixed. We can have discussions on a political legacy or economic legacy.
It's a media group's hurdle,
and there are many. I mean, he has highlighted internal security. There are striking foreign policy successes. This morning, Mr. Rajapaksa opened the huddle. One very little noticed episode in 1971, which figures only in Srinath's book, is what Indira Gandhi did in Sri Lanka in April of 1971 to help the Sri Lankans quell the JVP insurrection, and you know this better than most of us. So there are multiple stories and narratives on a person. After all, she's been Prime Minister for 16 years, so there must be a large number of highs. But I think our response was to this journalistic question, actually.
Actually going to endorse what Minnie's line of questioning and add something to it. So on the greatest achievement, if one has to pick one, I would expand what the two of you said. One of Indira Gandhi's great attributes, which she got from Nehru, was the respect for science and scholarship. The people you mentioned, Jairam, who left her in 1973, the least known today is Pitambar Pant, but he was inarguably the greatest. He set up, you know this, so it's not for you, it's for the other people who don't know this. He set up the National Committee for Environmental Protection and Control. There was a side to Indira Gandhi which was interested in nature and wildlife and birds, and that was the authoritarian side. So Mr. Valmik Thapar says the emergency was very good because you could kick out all the peasants and the Adivasis from the national parks. That's what made, so there was an authoritarian side to her too. But Pitambar Pant nourished the other side, balance between environment and development. Energy, Amulya Reddy, the kind of path we could have taken, which these gung-ho free marketeers have no understanding of, right? After 1991, who became the fall guys? Only the environmentalists. India Today, when Shekhar was in India Today, he was not responsible, he was not the editor, someone else was, would run, Tavleen Singh would attack Medha Patkar once a month, because she was stopping India from becoming Singapore. Right, so I think the respect for science space, we are in Bangalore. It was Indira Gandhi who, when Vikram Sarabhai died, called Satish Dhawan and said, I don't care, you have to take over the science program. And that is our greatest public sector achievement. So respect for science and scholarship, I think. But I want to add something else. Vinny didn't ask that. What was the most disastrous contribution of Indira Gandhi? What was her greatest failure? And I think all of you would agree, though Jairam probably can't say it publicly. Her greatest failure was the cultivation of dynasty in Indian politics. And it runs across the board. There are very good studies by Patrick French and Kanchan Chandra that show, except for the CPM. There's no other major party in which there's no dynasty. Mamta is busy promoting her nephew at the moment because she has no children. Right. Now, 1 in 5 MPs are, and these are linked because, Indira Gandhi got the respect of science and expertise from Nehru and from inside her. But will Rahul Gandhi know whom to contact if the head of the space program suddenly dies? Forget it. Other people in his party might, and maybe they'll give him good advice. It's possible. But I think, on a less facetious note, if you look at our great regional parties, the Hindu is a Tamil newspaper. The DMK, the Akalis, which Shekhar knows so well, these were parties, Akalis led the Gurdwara movement, social reform, gender equality. But now it is Karunanidhi to Stalin and Stalin from Stalin to Stalin's son. And this is, I'll just make one last point, sorry it takes so long. You see, why did dynasty spread in Indian politics so pervasively? Because the Congress, the great party of the freedom struggle, did it. If Indira Gandhi could promote her son, if Sonia Gandhi can promote her son, anyone can promote their son. And that is what the deepest damage she did to Indian democracy.
Well, just a comment on, a footnote on what Ram said. I'm glad he brought about the science and scholarship point. And I've always believed that Satish Dhawan, in many ways, epitomizes Indira Gandhi at her magnificent best. But the paradox of Indira Gandhi is that there is a Satish Dhawan and there is an R.K. Dhawan, you know.
I think on that note, time is up. Thank you so much.
Wasn't there the creation of the non-aligned movement also, which gave India a new direction? And you know, you listed so many of her credits, but wasn't the non-aligned movement also one of them?
No, it is not. Non-aligned movement predates her considerably. 1961 Belgrade conference is when it began. And again, like...
But the very first conference at which she took over charge was here, isn't it?
Yeah, but the thing is, you know, a bit like her father, she was not particularly keen on the non-aligned movement. I mean, that you know, is pretty well
No, I
established.
don't think so. I think she really put it forward.
By the way, Nehru never liked the word non-alignment. Never used the word non-aligned movement.
But what it symbolized?
And he was allergic to the word non-aligned movement. It was actually Krishna Menon who used the word non-aligned movement first. And there is a wonderful letter from Nehru to Krishna Menon, quoted in Gopal's biography, where Nehru writes to Krishna Menon before his visit to the US in 1949, October, says, "My dear Krishna, can't we be a little more aligned to the United States?" Was more of a pragmatist than we give him credit for, actually.
I think we have to end because this red light telling
3
us time
minutes
is
ahead,
up
yeah.
is flashing. Take one, please.
Yeah, there's been so much said about the legacy of Indira Gandhi. I can speak I've got at least 3 historians here, including Ram sitting right in the front. But growing up, I've experienced a bit of this history. 1982, G.D. Tapase and the shenanigans with preventing Devilal from becoming the Chief Minister of Haryana. 1984, N.T. Ramarao and the way he was disgracefully treated just after his operation. That, according to me, is the biggest legacy of Indira Gandhi. She sowed the cynicism in the midst of all of us about Indian democracy. That was her worst moment. A second worst moment is 1978, SGPC elections. She supported tacitly Bindranwale's candidates.
Shekhar.
And as a counterweight to the Akali Dal, I think these 2 points, I'm surprised that in such a long discussion, we have never talked about the role of Indira Gandhi in fomenting the rise of Bindranwale.
Well, I know that we are out of time and I have a flight. That's the reason I'm also letting pass Jairam's and Ram's references to me as a right-wing free market thug. Also, we said early morning in our early session that these days, if you are arguing in nuances, you've lost the argument. So let me not come with a nuancial argument. But look, it is simplistic to say it is a mythology that has been spread in Punjab. And sometimes mythologies are also necessary to let public opinion be calmed down. Srinath will tell you that the biggest mythology we've spread since '62 is that the Indian army had everything going for them if only the politicians had let them fight and given them the tools. That's not true. Indian army, in fact, in the northeast, in what was called as NEFA, was very well equipped. Isn't it true? But it was necessary for keeping the national morale and public that politicians had to take that blame. So India would not blame its armed forces. Now, Bhindranwale, there's been a convenient rewriting of the history that rising fundamentalist streak among the Sikhs at that time had nothing to do with the rise of Bhindranwale, that Indira Gandhi and Zail Singh created him, ran him, etc. It's true that when he decided to contest the SGPC elections of '78, they gave him money. And Zail Singh's view then used to be, because he was out of power, that when you are out of power, find a man who will make the demands that Akalis make when they are out of power. When they come to power, then they stop asking about autonomy and all that. So that was a cynical game for a very brief period. To say that they continue to patronize him, they didn't patronize him. It's just that government didn't know how to handle him. And he just went from, see, it's a complex history. The first massacre took place by Bhindranwale's people when nobody was in control of him. That was the Baisakhi day of 1978. Nirankaris killed his people, 13 of his people, on 13th of April 1978. And then things went out of control. So it's a very complex history. Today, because we compress everything into a tweet, it's convenient to say, oh, Indira Gandhi created Bhindranwale, and that's what... Bhindranwale created Bhindranwale, and Sikh religious politics created Bhindranwale. Sikh religious politics which controlled Shiromani Gurdwara Prabandhak Committee, which controlled the Golden Temple and other temples, which allowed weapons to come in, which allowed battlements to be built, which allowed machine guns to be fitted, right? All this didn't happen because Mrs. Gandhi gave Bhindranwale some money to fight SGPC elections of 78, in which he was wiped out very badly. So, you know, it's okay to say, all right, now everybody is forgiven because she did it, she's gone, Bhindranwale is gone. But as I said, it's convenient.
I just want to say one thing, that the life of Indira Gandhi demonstrates a truism of all strong leaders. That leaders have magnificent achievements when they have people around them who speak truth to power. When there is a shortage of people who speak truth to power, the decline starts. Her period of glory was a period when she had a handful of people who could tell her that if you want your son to manufacture a car, tell him to stay outside your house and run a business, not stay in your house and do this business. So those were the types of people, and she took them. She listened to them. And when she listened to these people, she had great achievements. And I think this is a lesson that is not without contemporary relevance. Strong leaders require people to speak truth to power and hold a mirror to them. And when they don't have these, you will have Tughlaqian decisions like demonetization.
On which note, I shall steal my opportunity for a cheap shot. If you have people close to you who can speak truth to power, you would not wear that suit.
Thank you so much for a very, very fascinating discussion.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jairam Ramesh, Mr. Srinath Raghavan, Mr. Shekhar Gupta, and Ms. Mini Kapoor. Mini, may I please request you to present mementos?